record to cloud. And good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Astrological Association conference for this year. We are very excited. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers, including, as you can see, Bill Meridian. We are very, very excited to have Bill here. Bill. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Astrological Association conference. Okay, sorry, there's a bit of... We are very excited. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers. Okay, so apologies about that. So today we have Bill Meridian here for two different workshops. Bill has been in the finance, investment and astrology industry since 1972, I believe. And he has been listed as the top 6 timers in Timer Digest for over 20 years and has also been #1 twice in 2016 and 2002, I believe. Yes. So, and then obviously, as many of you know, Bill has also been writing consistently for Dell Horoscopes since 1990 and is a regular contributing writer at Forbes.com. So please welcome Bill, and let's get started with this fantastic workshop. And okay. remember questions in the chat, please. Okay, that's it. I hand over to Bill.
By the way, I don't, should I be seeing the chat?
Well, only if you want to, don't worry, because we will be monitoring it. So if there are any questions, we can pass them on to you.
Okay. Well, first let me...
Yeah, sorry, one more thing, which yes. I forgot to mention now that we have more participants. Please, could you all open the click on participants in your Zoom, and then next to your name, hover over it, and there's a button which says more, and there's an option to rename yourself. Please, can you rename yourself to the exact name that you have registered under for the conference, so that we can all see who you are, and it also allows us to work more efficiently in case of questions and so on. Great, thank you very much, and apologies again. So over to Bill.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction, and thanks to the Astrological Association for your kind invitation to speak and do these workshops and the lecture tomorrow. I'm very happy to be here. This is Planetary Stock Trading. And for those of you who don't know, Planetary Stock Trading is about how I began to use astrology to pick stocks a very long time ago. And let me see the first slide. Oh, this is the last time I was #1 with Timer Digest in 2016. And actually, see, the #2 guy is Tom McClellan. Do you know Tom was #1 for the whole year until the last 3 days, and I sneaked in ahead of him, so I was #1 for 3 days, and I wound up getting it for the year. So it's pretty fortunate. I now work with Gene Vicotan at astroapp.com. That's astroapp.com. That is where many of these tools can be found. So that's Planetary Stock Trading on the web, and we're constantly building that and finding out new things. So I'll begin with, take this test. This is John Doe, May 8th, 1989, 9:30 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, New York City, New York. And there are the transits for June 21, 1997. And what kind of announcement did this person make on the date of this particular transit, that's 6/21/97? What was the effect on his reputation or public image? Note stationary Saturn, that was the day of the Saturn station on his midheaven. And there you see it. You see there's the MC, there's the Saturn. Notice that there's no orb. The orb is 0000. So next one, what kind of announcement did this person make? This is take test 2 on the date of the transits. What was the effect on his reputation or public image? This is Jane Doe, January 14th, 1946, 10 a.m., New York. Transits April 21, 2005. And you'll notice that Pluto is 24 Sagittarius 21. The midheaven is 24 Sagittarius 56. And as soon as my eye falls on Saturn, I'll tell you where it is. Oh, it's 21 Cancer 14, so it is 150 degrees. So it's a Saturn-Pluto quincunx in space right on the midheaven. Well, the answer to the question is these are not two people, as you might have guessed. The first chart was that of Cabletron. Cabletron no longer trades on the stock exchange. It was taken over. And here you see it closed the prior day, and it opened up, it closed at around 46, and it opened up at around 31, 32. That was the one that had Saturn on the midheaven. On the day, they announced their earnings. So earnings are announced 4 times a year. And the other one was Triple M. Triple M, and I think this was the exact date. No, this was the exact date down here, April 25. So as you can see in both cases, you had Saturn on the midheaven in the first case, a Saturn-Pluto quincunx hitting the midheaven in the second case, and both of them declined. I focused on the midheaven in both cases. Now, this is a very recent one. This is June 30th, 2020. When was this? Wait a minute, it couldn't be June 30th, could it? It must be May. I must have mistyped that. That's got to be May 30th, because June 30th is not quite here yet. But this is Campbell Soup. CPB is the ticker symbol. They reported earnings with Saturn 0 from their progressed midheaven, and look at the drop from 52 to 48, down about, that's about 10% in one day. So you obviously see the pattern here. The midheaven was very important. And this, I'm just showing you a few examples to get you interested, and then we'll go through the boring part of how to arrive at all this, what these charts are and how they work. This is a Stone Company. That is, I believe, the largest payment processor in Brazil. So they're sort of the Brazilian PayPal. This is June 22nd through 28. And it was earnings reported on the 27th of June. Jupiter was 60 degrees to the ascendant. Solar arc Uranus 180 degrees to the sun. And stationary retrograde Jupiter was 60 to Jupiter, 135 to the midheaven, and I'll repeat 60 to the ascendant. So it was actually a retrograde Jupiter station. And you could see the jump in the stock from 26 up to about 34. Now these companies were all reporting earnings, which I'll get into. And Ambarella, I wanted to get some recent examples in here. This is from early June. It's just early this month. And you'll notice that big pop up, and the next day they report earnings. So the stock went from 62 to 53. That is about a 10% move overnight. And here we find the transiting Mars-Pluto midpoint, 180 to the midheaven, and Mars-Uranus, 180 to the sun. And let's see, they announced on the 3rd of June. So this one was the day before. This one was about 2 days before. So you get the general idea. Planetary stock trading is a term I developed to describe this practice. The horoscopes can be cast for the time, date, and place of incorporation and for the first trade on an exchange. The ones you all saw as opening examples were horoscopes of first trade. Now, the incorporation chart reveals the fundamental operations of the company. About 70% of stocks in the US trading on the New York Stock Exchange are incorporated in the state of Delaware for tax reasons. According to state law, a time must be stamped on the papers when this happens. The document is the Certificate of Long Form of Good Standing. I'll repeat that. It's the Certificate of Long Form of Good Standing in the Secretary of State's Hall of Records. Now, let me just see what's on the next page. So matters such as strikes, new product success, the inner workings of the company are ruled by the incorporation chart. So if a client wanted to know, should I go to work there, or they have a new president, how does the new president fit into this incorporation picture? That would be the chart to use. My teacher was Charles Jane, And he said to me once, the moon and the moon in the midheaven in this chart do have some effect on the public perception of the company because an incorporation chart is a mundane chart. Now, I know in Japan, they call this the, well, in the United Arab Emirates, it's the foundation chart. In Japan, the date when the company was chartered. It's called incorporation here in America. You analyze this chart to see how a new product or a new CEO would work out or whether you'd want to work there. So again, Charles said the moon and the midheaven are the public in a mundane chart. So therefore, the moon and the midheaven in the incorporation chart do have some effect on the share price, on the reputation of the company. But the first trade chart rules how investors view the stock. You look at this chart to see how the release of earnings will influence the share price. That is the earnings surprise method, which is one method. We'll be looking at two today. And that is the one I began to use a long time ago. So companies, let me just peek ahead. Okay. Companies report earnings about exactly four times during the year. Most of them report January, April, July, and October. The really big companies, Apple, Google, Microsoft. And there are very few, for example, in the last week, very few companies reported earnings, certainly not the well-known ones. The first trade chart, all of mine are obtained from the respective exchange, either from the NASDAQ or from the New York Stock Exchange. And I'd like to just go in a little bit, explain the data to you. In the old days, when I was originally at the Value Line Investment Survey 77 to 80, which is a bastion of fundamental analysis, and I had to follow 40 companies and write reports on them. So one morning, I took a not very memorable bus trip at very, very early morning and down to Delaware. And I actually was out, it was pitch black. I got out of the bus depot and walked about 2 blocks, and they opened up, and they're very nice people. And I told them I'm coming, and I said, I'd like to look at the incorporation papers of certain companies. And here is what the lady told me. She said, well, we opened around 9 a.m. It was 8 or 9. And after about 1 hour, she comes in the morning, and she has these big folders. And she opens it up. And there on the left side is a history of all the actions that the owners took in relation to that company in Delaware. In other words, when they first incorporated, they may reincorporate, they may change their name, and it's all listed in all the documents on the right side. It's about that thick. And I asked her how a company becomes officially active, and she said, well, if I'm here around 9, I look at all the companies that are lined up to be incorporated that day, and I check all the papers and make sure they're in order. If they are, she takes a timestamp and she sets it, let's say, for 10 a.m. on that date, and pow, she hits one after the other, after the other, after the other. And then a big gentleman with a rolling cart comes and takes them all and wheels them down into the catacombs and the archives, wherever they go. So I asked her, I said, if you said it at 10 a.m., at 9:59 a.m., I would not have been able to sue that company. Is that correct? And she said, yes. In the eyes of the state of Delaware, it did not exist at 9:59 and only came into being at 10 a.m. Most, I say about a third, 30 to 40% of all the companies inked in Delaware that I've ever seen are incorporated at 10 a.m. Some at 9. So the second most frequent time is 1:30. I guess that's when they get back from lunch. So that does exist. And again, 70% of the companies are incorporated in Delaware. And that is what I was using. I had for the 40 companies I was hired to follow, I had exact incorporation times for 28 of them. And of course, in 1977, I had only been studying astrology 5 years, which I really wasn't enough. So I adopted the very simple rule of thumb that if the chart was extremely afflicted, I figured prospects for the company were lowered. If it was very well aspected, then I thought the prospects were enhanced. Most of the time, it was just neutral. Some of these companies, Campbell Soup, I had to follow Heinz, Nabisco. These are huge food companies. And as somebody once said, in order to hurt such a company, in order to disrupt its operations, management not only has to be stupid, they have to have malice. In other words, their earnings don't fluctuate much at all. And in fact, we had an earnings predictability factor, which ran from 5 up to 100. And then they created a composite of all the companies, and I was supposed to beat that index. It was 2.75 for me, and if I came in, I think under that, then I was considered to have done my job. Well, most quarters I was there. I was there for 3 years, and senior guy said, "You're beating your index by a consistent margin." And I said, "Yeah, of course, I never said that the incorporation chart was having an influence, but now what I mean by very afflicted is, well, let's just say the company had a stellium of planets in the third decade of Capricorn and Cancer. So right now, Saturn and Pluto would be conjunct and opposite those planets. What I would do is presume something would go wrong during this transit and that their earnings would be reduced. So I would scale my earnings down. And the way it works is, if the company is, we have numerous guys and girls on Wall Street making estimates. And there are companies like IBES, IBES, I don't know who does it anymore because I've been out for so long, that keep track of all the earnings estimates. So let's say the average for everybody on Wall Street is $1 per share. And this is very important, if the actual earnings come in more than one standard deviation above or below $1 per share, you get a sharp reaction in the share price. Now, as Charles Jane used to say, Bill, there's got to be something in nature that will tell you these things in advance. And if you've never heard him speak, Charles was sort of a combination or a cross between Copernicus and W.C. Fields, and a very odd delivery. And so that is the way I handled it. Now, if Jupiter, let's say Jupiter and Saturn are going into early Aquarius, I would look more favorably upon companies that had a great deal of planets in Aquarius or in air signs, for obvious reasons. Most of the time, I'd say 60 to 80% of the time, I didn't change the estimates at all because it had to be something very powerful. If very little was affecting the chart, I just assume, $1 a share is fine. I might make it $1.02 or 98 cents. And by the way, if you wander too much, I was frequently called in. If you wander too much from that index, the manager calls you in and says, "What do you know, young man, that everybody in Wall Street does not know?" And of course, I'm not going to say horoscope of incorporation. So there are 4 possible combinations. Both charts can be afflicted. Both charts can be well aspected. One could be well aspected where the other is afflicted, or vice versa. So the possibilities are both charts are afflicted. The news is bad and the stock is declining. The incorporation chart, in other words, is under great stress. So is the first trade chart. Well, that's logical. It's the stock is declining and the horoscope of incorporation is afflicted. So there's something very obviously wrong with the company. 2, both are well aspected. So the news is bullish and the stock rises. Again, very simple to understand. The 3 and 4 are a little tougher. Incorporation is well aspected and the first trade chart is not. The operations are improving, but investors do not see it yet. And I once had a fellow on the phone, and he said, Bill, I've made all these improvements in the company. I've improved the balance sheet, and we've made a lot of very positive changes, and yet the stock still isn't moving. So I said, well, you and I both see it, but we don't have the purchasing power to move the stock. And we both chuckled, but what I said was true. Enough people who move the stock with purchasing power have to see this and act on this news. Now, number 4, the incorporation chart can be afflicted, but the first trade chart is bullish. The operations have not turned around. In other words, fundamentally, the earnings are declining. Perhaps they're jettisoning some of the senior management, but the investors are buying the stock in anticipation of an improvement. That happens frequently. So in that case, the incorporation chart is afflicted. First trade chart looks quite bullish. So those are the possibilities. That's the interplay between the charts. Now, this one I just included because this is actually a client asked me about this a few years ago. Let me see if I can get the 2014 to 2015. This is Chesapeake Energy Corporation, November 19th, 1996, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Notice it is not started trading in Delaware. In states where it does not trade and they don't have a time, the nearest I've ever been able to figure out, for example, the state of Connecticut said it's a live incorporation at midnight on that day. So I set this for 0 a.m. I assume the same thing goes on. There are very few companies incorporated in Oklahoma. So, and let me go back and, by the way, say before I leave incorporation charts that Boeing, for example, is incorporated in Delaware, Dover, Delaware, but it lives or exists in out in the state of Washington on the other coast. So in that case, what I do is I set the chart up, but then I relocate it to the company's home base, because obviously all the companies do not live at the state capital, Dover, Delaware. I believe Boeing is in Spokane, Washington, and the big banks are in New York. So that's how I handle that. So this is set for Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, November 19th, 1996. Now, Q4 2014 to Q1 2015, I came out very bearish and advised them to sell the stock. The 2015 solar eclipse at 0 Aries was conjunct natal Saturn. Let's look for 0 Aries. And here we find it over here in the 8th house by Juno. Now let me jump back. Saturn ran over the sun, stationed on natal Pluto, and went direct on the sun. So it went forward, stationed on natal Pluto. I didn't see that. Went direct on the sun. Okay, Pluto probably meant, I meant to write Juno there. Earnings topped in Q4 and fell into deficit in 2015. Now, Pluto making its last conjunction to natal Jupiter will likely mark the end of the crisis in December. So Pluto was going directly over Jupiter. And as you see, look at this, Jupiter 16 Capricorn, Neptune 25 Capricorn, Uranus 1 degree of Aquarius. There's the Uranian Vulcanus over at 19 Cancer. We have Venus 25 Libra. And you're probably wondering how that worked out. Well, they went bankrupt sometime in the last few months. Well, the stock was trading for pennies a share. So Saturn and Pluto were in this area, and it started out actually with, I do believe there was an eclipse on Saturn or on Pluto. I think that was back in 2014 or 15. But anyway, this is a horoscope of incorporation set for midnight in Oklahoma City, extremely afflicted. And now here is the share price. Now remember, the affliction started up in here. And this was a case where the chart is just so afflicted, the incorporation chart, that the earnings fall into deficit, the earnings are negative, and I believe they went bankrupt for just pennies a share. I think it was around $1 or $2 in the last month or so. So I wanted to give you an incorporation chart just to explain that to you. Now the first trade horoscope is set for the opening of trading on the day of the listing. It may not actually begin trading at that time, thus it is really better termed a first listing chart. As George Bayer wrote in the 1940s, the chart is akin to the opening of a store. Let us say that the store opens at 9:30 a.m., but the first customer does not make a purchase until 9:45. The point is that the stock could not have been purchased before 9:30 a.m. when the market opened. The fact that somebody actually purchases the share at 9:45 is okay, and I'll explain that. One can add the angles for the time that the first trade actually occurred if it can be obtained. It adds a second set of angles to the chart, which I think are subsidiary to the actual. to the actual angles. And the use of the angles set for the opening of the exchange. I have an example of Facebook and Planetary Stock Trading 4. So just to go back, usually if a new issue is very well anticipated, it starts trading the minute the market opens up at 9:30. Sometimes it is so eagerly anticipated that the market becomes what they used to call locked. I don't know if they still call it that. There were so many buy orders and so few shares for sale that, let's just say the stock was priced at 20 and it becomes what they say oversubscribed and infloods a number of buy orders. They can't find a price. They try 28, 30, 32, 33, and it could take as long as a couple hours to sort out. So many people have debated me and said that for example, Facebook supposedly, depending on who you talk to, started trading either at 11:15, 11:30, or 11:45. That's not a good example because there was a problem with the reporting of that stock on the first day. So in other words, the stock is open for trading. You can call, place an order, you can set an order online, but you don't know what price you get because it is trading. It's just that they can't resolve the imbalance. So that's a locked market. But very, very small unknown companies, it is quite possible that the stock starts trading at 9:30 and opens for trading at 9:30 and nobody buys it until 9:45. That is quite possible. I have not found the additional set of angles to be valuable. And as I said, I've been using that professionally and writing about it in Dell Horoscope for many years. And by the way, I don't know if you realize Dell Horoscope published their last issue in April after 84 years, one Uranus return. I was writing for them for 30 years, one Saturn return. So the combination of Saturn and Uranus put Dell Horoscope under, and I will now be writing in the Mountain Astrologer, beginning with the August issue. So I use the angle set for the opening of the exchange. Let me just see what is next. There was another point I wanted to make. And I've got numerous examples where because I was trained in the Hamburg school early on, the midheaven is extremely important, as is rectification. And Charles Jane, my teacher, was a master of rectification. And I used the time that the stock started trading, and besides, IBM started trading in 1924. Who knows, how do you get the time from 1924? There were no computerized records. These very old stocks that have been around for a long time, like Triple M, Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing, there's no way to obtain any other time. And the market, by the way, did open at 10 a.m. up until September 30th, 1985. From that date to this, it opens at 9:30, and that's both the NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange. So it's either 10 a.m. or it's 9:30. Now, I'll explain where I actually started getting the dates. I was always with a New York Stock Exchange member firm, so they couldn't very well turn down my requests. So I was with Value Line and Payne Weber, and I would call the exchange and say the research section of the exchange, are two very lovely gentlemen there who handled my requests. And I said, guys, I'd like to ask you, is this date available? And I said, sure, I can give it to you. And I said, finally, I said, look, guys, I really want to get a lot of them. They said, well, how many at a time? I said, is 10 okay? And they said, sure. They were very cooperative. And that was the only way to get them in those days. There was no public record and there was no internet in the 80s. And during the course of this effort, one time I asked about General Electric, and I have this in my book in the introduction, and I hear the guy get up, walk, and then I hear a file open and close, and I said, Rich, what did you just do? And he said, well, that company is so old. We have a date back prior to 1900. I said, really? Could you give it to me? And he said, sure. And he said, it was a different company then. I said, that's okay. I said, I'll take it anyway. I'll take, astrologers will take any data we can get. So that is where the dates come from. And then subsequently, they put them up on the internet, and they did a poor job of it. was I actually remember when GameStop started trading, I noted the date and started trading right at 9:30, and they had the date wrong on their on the internet, on their website. So I called up and they said, well, we didn't do that. We are the research section. Public relations did that. And I said, well, tell me about it. How did they do it? They hired a bunch of temporary employees. I said, oh boy. I said, how did they know which date to take? And they said, they just told them, take the first date that you see, put that on the internet. Subsequently, they went back and they cleaned it all up. They corrected a lot of those. Right now, as has been the habit lately, they are removing more and more information from the exchange. They no longer have the date of first listing at the New York Stock Exchange. I cannot find it on their website. I called up and nobody knows what I'm talking about. So you have a new crop of young people who don't appreciate the value of the data. And this is rampant around Wall Street. A number of number sets that I relied upon as technical indicators have disappeared, unfortunately. Now here's a 9:30 example, Acacia Communications. This company listed on the NASDAQ, Acacia Communications, and the second set of letters is, that's the ticker symbol. ACIA is what you punch in to the computer or to Bloomberg. That's its symbol. That's how you get the price. May 13th, 2016, 9:30 a.m. Now, there was a time floating around, I get this all the time. People who are beginning in this area say, but I got a different time from the internet. And I said, well, where did you get it from? I'd look it up. And on August 12th, a positive earnings surprise sent the share price up by almost 40%. The August 13th Saturn station at 9 Sag was 135 degrees to the MC if one uses an 10:59 a.m. time. So somebody called me up and said, this company, May 13th, 2016, 10:59 a.m. I said, no, it's 9:30. And I kept track of this because it was right here in the month of July, somewhere in here. And I said, well, if that time is correct, then the August 13th station, which is over here, is going to be 135 degrees to the midheaven, which would be bearish. And Uranus would have been in the MC. And obviously not. So Uranus Saturn as a combination is bearish. So this stock using a time of 10:59 a.m. would have had a Saturn Uranus 135 connected to the midheaven. Obviously it didn't work out. So it's not it is not 10:59, it's 9:30. Otherwise, that chart would have been reversed. It would have been a decline. So that's just one. So Jupiter was conjunct the natal and the progressed sun at the time. I have this up at the top. Use the proper time. So this, I think, yes. So the midheaven is the most important point. I've covered most of this in the first trade horoscope. That is your reputation, how you're known. It reflects the public reaction to the stock, especially at earnings reporting time. Now, obviously, rare events such as a slow transit has a greater impact than does a rapid transit. Natal planets, of course, do not move at all. The progressed planets move but are slow. So I analyze it in the following fashion. First, the natal chart. Second, the progressed chart direct. Third, the progressed chart converse. Usually I never get to the tertiary horoscopes, but I have used them, direct and converse. So let me just say, if the natal, what I first do is a screen through my database, and the current database of New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ stocks is about 3,000 stocks. I update it every Sunday. Stocks get their names changed, they stop trading, new companies come on the exchange, And all of this is in my program. It's also up at Astro app. I send these changes to Gene every Sunday. So I try and keep that database very fresh. And using software, depending, you can do this at Astro app. You can use Solar Fire. If you know that Jupiter is going to be, let's see, where did it just go stationary? 25 Capricorn. You can run 25 Capricorn conjunct in opposition, plus or minus several degrees, and you'll see all the charts that are being hit. And if you select natally, if you select midheaven, you'll get all the charts that are being affected by the Jupiter station. Now, if there is nothing happening in the natal chart, I do go to the progress chart, and then I go to the converse progress chart. And I have examples in which there's nothing happening in the natal chart, there's nothing happening in the direct progress chart, but there's a lot happening in the converse chart. And one of the mistakes I made early on that I corrected was not paying enough attention to the progressed moon, because the progressed moon, excuse me 1 minute, the progressed moon is, as Charles used to say, it's very overrated. Its effect lasts 1 to 3 days. But let's remember, for a progress chart, for that moment, that is the moon in that chart. So one of the mistakes I made was underemphasizing the progressed moon. And I have examples where Jupiter was exactly on the progressed moon. Remember, the progressed chart is a separate, distinct horoscope for that moment. Jupiter going over the moon means the public feels bullish. I've actually, I have rare cases where all three, 1, 2, and 3 are all positively, bullishly aspected. Very few. Most of the time, it gets difficult. The first natal chart looks correct. Number 2, the progress chart looks great. They both look bullish. You get to the third one, and it looks very bearish. And I've had the reverse happen. In those cases, I usually pass up those companies. I remember being in Astrology 101 with Charles Jane, and you're trying to learn transits, progressions, solar arcs. And I said, Mr. Jane, if you have positive aspects, like a number of positive effects to the stock, to the person's horoscope, and a number of negative, do they cancel out? And he said, no, of course not. And he liked to give the example of a woman driving in his area, which was rural, during the winter. She hit an icy path. She swerved to avoid a deer. She actually hit the deer. The car went out of control. She went up on somebody else's property, damaged their property, and she walked away without a scratch. And then he went through the effects to that lady's horoscope. And she said Jupiter to the sun probably saved her. Physically, she had not a scratch. The deer was dead, the car was damaged, the property was damaged. So you get everything, as you probably know. You've done astrology, you probably already know this. You get a mix of the different effects, but not here. They tend, in a first trade chart, the effect of the transits and progressions and solar arcs tends to net out. In other words, if you've got +5 and -5, you have 0. If you have a lot of aspects to the chart by transit, some of them are bearish, some of them are bullish. What you usually get is what's called an outside day. In other words, the price rallies to a new high, well above the high of the previous day. Then during the day, the news sort of filters through the system, and then it closes. It goes down below the close for the prior day, and it ends up about unchanged. So very heavy volume, a lot of commentary in the media and on television, but the stock barely moves. And tertiaries, if nothing's happening in 1, 2, or 3, occasionally I've been able to get something out of the tertiaries because they're moving very fast. But I have very clear examples where charts number 1, 2, or 3 differed very much in condition from the tertiary, number 4. And it was those first 3 stocks that held sway. They're more powerful. The natal chart is not moving at all. Progress charts very slowly. Tertiary charts moving too fast. But if nothing is happening in the first 3, occasionally I rely on number 4. So this was actually written in Dell Horoscope, and in those days I had to write 6 months prior to the magazine. So this company, Henry Schein, HSIC, Healthcare Products Distributor, was reporting on 11/6/2014, and this was written in May, 6 months prior to the event. And I wrote, the company is scheduled to report between the 5th to the 9th. Buy stock if they do. On the 9th, Jupiter is contraparallel to Sun on that day and is 45 degrees to the midheaven on the next day. This will likely lead to a positive earnings surprise. This is the opening. Let's see. No, this is Henry Schein, November 3, 1995. That's 11/3/95. They began trading. And let's just see what I said. Jupiter was contraparallel to the Sun and 45 degrees to the MC on that day. And there you see the jump up in the stock from about 120 up to about 130. That's about an 8% move. And by the way, the way I became interested in planetary stock trading was by seeing days like this, where there were big gaps up and big gaps down, and saying there's got to be something happening. At first I thought in the incorporation chart, but certainly in the first trade chart, I was attracted by days like that. So very frequently, now when I was a fund manager, I was at Abu Dhabi Investment Authority for 13 or 14 years, I would wait just before they announced earnings, because if you can get a jump like that, sometimes you buy a stock and you hold it and it goes up 10% the whole year. If you can get a head start, and this is about 8%, I think? Yeah. If you can get a head start of 7 to 8% on day one of the trading, that's fabulous. That gave me a margin. Well, this was 6.6% actually. I just see it up at the top. That is a great start. It puts you ahead of everybody else. And if you are a fund manager, there's an old story that there were two fund managers walking through the jungle, and they come to a clearing, and there's a tiger getting ready to pounce. And fund manager one turns to fund manager two and sees that he's putting on running shoes. And he says, "What are you putting on running shoes for? You can't outrun a tiger." And portfolio manager number two says to one, "I don't have to outrun the tiger. I only have to outrun you." And that is the story with fund managers. I am absolutely convinced if you took two fund managers of equal ability, equal education, working just as hard, and one had astrology and the other didn't, I'm convinced the one that had the astrology would outperform the other one. Now, I mentioned the earnings surprise method. Earnings announcement dates are obtained from 3 sites. Now, right now, and again, there have been a lot of changes on the internet. A lot of companies are cutting expense, and they're not reporting numbers and data that they used to provide. And right now I'm using StockTwits, stocktwits.com, their earnings calendar. That's a pretty good one. Yahoo Finance is not very good in that the dates that they list are not always updated. StockTwits has a more complete listing than Yahoo. And I have an example on the next page. And there's nothing that is, that says 3 sites. Actually, rightline.net was the best. They stopped putting the numbers up. The company can always announce early. If they know the numbers are going to be fabulously good or dreadfully bad, sometimes the president will say, next week we're reporting earnings. I just want to get everybody ready for, let's say, a shock or for a big surprise. And then most of the movement, most of the juice goes out of the stock. There's no way of defending against that. You just have to keep your eyes open. And if you find differing, which sometimes you will, you'll find different dates listed. For example, NASDAQ.com also has the earnings dates. I find Yahoo the least reliable, StockTwits most reliable. But if you go to the company's own page and you go to investor relations, they're not going to get their own date wrong. It's just that it's very hard to look up all of the companies by going to all of the websites of each company. It's easier to get a listing, and the listings look like this. This is StockTwits. This is, I cut the date off, but there's the name of the company, and above it, that is the ticker symbol, AHEXO. You might be more familiar with Lululemon. They make athletic wear. Ticker symbol is LULU, and there's Adobe, Dave & Buster's, and there's the current price of the stock with a little chart. But this is very important. Are they reporting before the bell, in other words, before the market opens, or after? Now, right now it is Friday. So if I look at yesterday, if you look at stocks that are reporting on Friday, if they're reporting before the bell, you have to take your position or buy or short sell the stock on the day before, because if they report before the market opens up at 9:30, you have no chance to take advantage of the move in the stock. After the bell means, for example, after the bell for today would mean after 4 o'clock, and they don't do that on Fridays. So the next date you would look at would be Monday. You would look at Monday before the bell, which means you'd have to, if you want to take a position, you have to do it on Friday before the market closes. If it says after the bell, as this one says right here, after the bell means it closes at, after the market closes at 4 p.m. Monday, you have the whole day to assess it and decide whether you want to take a position or not. So that is what the earnings calendar looks like. And right now, you can have sometimes in the heavy earnings seasons, January, the next one is July, and we're going to actually take a real look forward at July toward the end of the presentation. You can have 120 companies reporting in one day, and in that case, I do concentrate on two stocks or two features. Number one, if I've used it before and it's worked, I know that that chart is very sensitive. I'll give you an example. They're no longer a big company. In fact, I just forgot their name. Novell, Novell. I swear to you, that stock never moved according to its first trade chart. And the weirdest thing, I was out in Silicon Valley on a trip for the Arabs looking at companies. And I ran into a guy who, he said, I've read your book, can we meet? And he said, Novell responds much better to its incorporation chart than its first trade chart. And I said, that is strange that you should say that to me, because I never had any success with that chart, with that first trade chart. He suggested, he found the incorporation chart worked better. So I'll just pass that on to you. And the second point is Novell. Their Pluto is 4 Scorpio 38. My sun is 4 Taurus 38. There's no warp, and it's an opposition, which is a hard aspect. I never had any success with that company. If the chart makes hard aspects to yours, you're better off just passing it by and finding some companies that do have very soft positive connections to your chart. And I'll tell you one story. When I was a junior analyst at Value Line, I was also covering trucking stocks, and there's the company is currently called ABF, Arkansas Best Freight, in the old days. And I phoned one day to just run my my analysis past him and asked him some questions. And the fellow, it's down south, and it's one of these, he sounded like a Southern senator. It's a character type here. And it says, hello, son, this is H.L. Hembry. I'm the chairman of Arkansas Best. And he and I hit it off great. And by the end of the call, he said, son, whenever you call me H.L. Hembry. I am the chairman. You call me directly, and I'll talk to you. It turns out that Arkansas Best had their moon conjunct my sun. This is the incorporation chart, and I had my sun conjunct their moon. My moon's in Aries. Their sun was in Aries, conjunct my moon. My sun's in Taurus. Their moon in Taurus was on my sun. I always found it very easy to forecast their earnings. I got right through to the chairman. I got very good information from them. That's what I'm referring to. So let's look at the earnings surprise method. The great thing about the earnings surprise method is I have actually, for real, bought stocks 5 minutes before the close and sold them 10 minutes after the opening. I held them for 15 minutes of clock time. It's very much like this. It's a bad example, but if you're in a war and people are shooting and you've got to move from one trench to another, you're not going to waltz. You're going to run. You want to minimize the time you're exposed to fire. And there are so many things. I think everybody out there has done enough astrology to know there are Uranian planets, there's heliocentric planets, how many thousands of asteroids? They're discovering new objects all the time. How do we know there isn't some great planet or asteroid named Wall Street that controls all stock prices that I don't know about yet? So anything can go wrong. And the way this method works is you're holding it only for the time it gets that spark. Either Jupiter is conjunct Uranus, transiting Jupiter is conjunct Uranus. That prior night and the next morning, they report a big earnings surprise to the upside. The stock jumps. And by the way, for real, the first hour of trading is known to be the most emotional. So that's now 9:30 to 10:30. So I actually owned Mattel, ticker symbol MAT, the toy company. It jumped 20% in the first hour of trading. It closed the day up 12%. In other words, had I sold it after 1 hour, I would have had a 20% gain. That's one of the biggest in one day that I've ever experienced. It doesn't happen all the time. And by the end of the day, it settled down to 12%. What happened was there was so much excitement at the opening that people just can't wait to buy. And then the message starts to sink in that, gee, that's pretty good, but, and then the stock starts to trail off. So that is the reason that they're sold pretty quickly, unless I have another reason for holding the stock. And you're probably wondering, what is the batting average, the hit rate? Well, it's been running about 65%, and now more like towards 70. And as you'll see, as we move further on, I'll show you how I've improved the hit rate over the years. And last August, I had one of my best months. I hit 12 out of 15 stocks in 1 week, 5 trading days. The next week, it was 2 out of 8. And the next week, it was 2 out of 3. So that averages out to about 60 to 70% correct. There's another factor you have to consider, and that is in the third or fourth week, I hit 2 out of 3, plus 9%, plus 8%, minus 4%. Now, if you average the three together, you still have a gain. So that would be what? 17 minus 4 is 13% divided by 3 is an average 4%. If you can get 4% every day, and there are 252 trading days a year, you will end up riding around in steaks and eating Cadillacs. So in the week that I hit 12 out of 15, it was the single best week I ever had. In the in-between week, I hit 2 out of 8. But the 6 losses were very small and the 2 gains were sizable. So it was only a small net loss for the week. The percentage change is obviously important. You're looking to maximize the percentage change. And on average, I think if a chart is well aspected, it moves about 2 to maybe 4%. If it is really super well aspected, you could get 10, and with Mattel, it's even 20. I believe Mattel was on it was the day of its Jupiter return, and that is a method, the Jupiter return method. That's pretty heavy. Usually, I can tell you now that one of the most bearish effects is to have Pluto opposite the midheaven, opposite the direct progressed midheaven, or opposite the converse progressed midheaven. So that's Pluto opposite the midheaven is very bearish. Saturn opposite the midheaven is next in line. And one of the most bullish is Jupiter parallel or contraparallel the sun of the midheaven. And Charles Jane said that a parallel or a contraparallel was more powerful than a conjunction or an opposition, but he said the effect was more diffuse if you're talking about a person's horoscope. I did run a test in which I took the moon conjunct or opposite a major axis in the IBM horoscope. And now the moon obviously is moving like crazy. It's moving very fast. And so I had about 1,000 hits. I did conjunction and opposition to a very important bullish aspect in IBM's chart. And I took parallel and contraparallel, the same axis. And I found out that the percent gain was about 20% greater with the parallels and contraparallels. Now, I'm not saying 20% of the share price. I don't mean that. I mean, if the stock was up 1% or 0.5% using the conjunction and opposition, then it was up about 0.6%. Now, 0.6% would be 20% greater than 0.5%. So I'm not saying that the share price goes up 20% with the parallel and contraparallel. I'm just saying that what he said was borne out by the tests I ran using the moon, and the one I remember is IBM. So the very first thing you do is you look, for example, for next month, what is the most powerful axis in space? Everybody here, I'm sure, knows that Jupiter and Pluto are in very late Capricorn. Saturn is in early Aquarius. If you run a sweep through all the charts and you pop up, let's say, to the midheaven or to the sun, you will then pop up all those charts. If you use this degree band from 25 Cap to, let's say, 1 Aquarius, you can pop up all the charts that are being aspected. You could run hits to the midheaven, hits to the sun. Now, the more planetary activity during the reporting period, the better. If there's business as usual during the reporting period, you're not going to get big moves in the charts. If you have Jupiter and Saturn stationary, that's great, because that means a lot of them are going to be have Jupiter on the MC, Jupiter on the sun. Some of them will have Saturn square the midheavens, Saturn square the sun, 45 and 135. The more planetary activity, the better. And I remember, I think it was back in 97 or, 97, Jupiter, Uranus, and Neptune all stationed from October 8th to the 14th. 1994. 1997, it was October or November, Saturn and Uranus went stationary within 24 hours, 135 degrees apart. So if you got hit by one, you got hit by the other. And I started doing astrology in 72, and I got in the habit of asking my business associates and buddies, what was the toughest time you ever had in business? So, this year, and I'd look at their natal chart and see it was some combination of Saturn and Uranus. So that is a tough aspect. And in that 1997 autumn, anybody who had Saturn on the midheaven had Uranus 135 to it, and they were both stationary. So you had Saturn Uranus equals midheaven, Saturn Uranus equals sun. A guy I know emailed me and said, am I missing something? Why are these stocks falling so hard by such great percentages? It was the Saturn and Uranus stationary 135 degrees apart. And as we know, that does not happen every day. That's rare. So I have here October 2021, Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto are stationing all in that month. That's 1 year from October. Now that's the type of thing that makes this very easy. And now you see how this axis hits the charts at the time of the announcement. And I've already told you when most of them report. And I've already told you that stocks get most volatile during these months. And by the way, that is true. Around earnings reporting time, there have been many scholastic articles that show that stocks get more volatile. That only makes sense. Everyone's looking at their earnings. Select those that receive hits to the MC, the sun, the moon, or the ascendant within 1 to 2 degrees. Major axes containing 5 to 6 planets are also effective, like a big fixed, like a big T-square. The more, the merrier. So let me, I'll go through this a bit fast. The most important thing here is Jandro's concept of time orb, which is number 3. In case you didn't know who he was, Lorne Edward Jandro was an astrologer in Los Angeles. He and Charles Jane never met, but they corresponded by mail back in the days when people wrote letters. He was a mathematician and a radio engineer, so he had very high skill set. His astrology, I think, is advanced by today's standards. And he died in the when I was about 3 years old, around 1952 or 3. He was associated with Kenneth Brown of Cleveland. Ken was the people person. Ken had an astrology business, and he and Jandro teamed up, Jandro doing most of the technical work, and they advised businessmen. I was later told by Jane that Jandro and Brown were W.D. Gann's astrologer. W.D. Gann, William D. Gann of Texarkana, Texas, was supposedly one of the great traders of all time. And his grandmaster secret is buried under one point of the Great Pyramid. And if you listen to Led Zeppelin records played sideways at the summer solstice, you might get enlightened at the pyramid. There's a lot of mythology around Gann. And my experience has been, after all these years, it's like the old parable of the blind men feeling the different parts of the elephant, and the one that's got the tail is saying an elephant is like a rope, it's stringy, and another one's holding the tusk. I don't think anybody has all of Gann's work or his secrets, but if Jandro was doing the work, then it was pretty advanced. and by the night, and Jane had to finish it. And a couple months earlier, Brown's wife had died. So John Joe, Mr. and Mrs. Brown all died in a very narrow time frame. I guess you can make conspiracy theory that they were bumped off by the Illuminati. I don't know how that happened. So now the importance of the, well, I'll just say I recommend selecting about 10 very liquid, in other words, a great deal of volume, stocks that trade options, which I'll talk about a little later. I would avoid utilities, real estate investment trusts, and stocks that are not dependent on earnings. I like industrial companies, particularly technology. And I already mentioned to you about parallels and contraparallels. Now, back in 75, I had the great honor and pleasure of hosting your very own John Addy when he was speaking in the United States. He needed a place to stay. And that was in northern New Jersey. And I spent a week with him, and he did a lecture in which he handed out a sheet, numbers 1 through 9, the meanings of the basic harmonics. And I pointed out to him that multiples of 15 degrees were very frequently turned up in big market moves. In other words, moves of the overall Dow Jones Industrial Average, the S&P 500. And I said, you've got, I said, 15 divided into 360 is the 24th harmonic. And I said, John, on your sheet 1 through 9, I do not see harmonic 24. And he said to me, well, to get that, you take the meanings of 3 and 8, 3 times 8, 24, or 4 times 6, again, 24, and combine them. And we looked at it, and one set of numbers would be stasis, no change, Saturnine, status quo, and the other would be change, fluctuation. So we came to the conclusion that harmonic 24, multiples of 15 degrees, had something to do with change of trend. And that turns out to be important. And then I realized my chart and all my compadres, the guys who trade stocks, Arch Crawford, and the old days, the late Joe Granville, Bob Prechter with the Elliott Wave Theorist, our horoscopes were loaded with 15-degree multiples. So we must because the harmonic 24 is very strong in our natal charts, we very much enjoy the fluctuations. Now, someone who does not have that and likes matters to be calm probably doesn't have a lot of 24th harmonic angles. And the reason that's important, one day I went to a bunch of companies that made big earnings moves that I had missed. They made big moves in their share price when their earnings were announced. And I said, why did I miss these? The outer planets moved all these other charts, all these other share prices, but not this one. And the answer to the question was those planets by transit were 75, 105, and 165 degrees from the midheaven, the sun, and these stocks that moved. And that was, when I say recent advances in planetary stock trading, I'm always evolving this, and that was a big breakthrough. Lorne Edward Jandreau, in the writing in the 30s and 40s, was the only astrologer, or he was the first one, using these angles, 75, 105, and 165. They're members of the 24th harmonic family, 5 times 15, 7 times 15, and so on. Today, of course, they're, I think they're used more frequently, but I had to open up whatever software I was using and add these aspects in, because I want to know when these angles are made, transits to natal charts. So now take this group that you've screened and look at the progressed charts, direct and converse. Hits to the MC are always best. Moon and sun are number 2. If the MC, the midheaven, is very afflicted at the time of an earnings report, the report will not be well received. That's not to say that the company is doing poorly. I mean, it may be that the earnings are up 10%, but everyone was looking for 15. And so there's a disappointment and the stock gets sold off. It's the first trade chart is how the investment community feels about the stock. And if it is very afflicted, that chart, at the time of an earnings announcement, it means they're going to come to a bearish conclusion and sell the stock. And the reverse is true if it appears bullish. So that's the way to look at it. It is how the people feel about the stock. And I've sat, when at Paine-Webber in New York, we've had the quote, what we call the Quotron machine on the desk. And, people would come in and have coffee and say, oh, the market's going to open. First it was 10 o'clock, then it was 9:30. It's going to open in 10 minutes. I wonder what Warner Communications will do. Warner Communications had the Sun conjunct Jupiter in the 10th house of their first trade chart. And they were always mentioned on the radio. They were one of the most active stocks on the exchange. And Sun conjunct Jupiter in house number 10, very noticeable. A company that everybody talks about. What did Warner do today? How did it close? If you visited their corporate headquarters, their incorporation chart set for New York had Venus on the ascendant. You walked in, they had a very big art collection, and they went out of their way to hire sexy, attractive young secretaries and administrative assistants. Venus on the ascendant in the incorporation chart. Sun conjunct Jupiter in the 10th house of the first trade chart. Now, these are general rules. Let's see if I can get rid of this thing. This I picked up. I always listen to people who trade for a living who never work for anyone else. One of those was the late Richard Diamond, whose workshop and courses I took. That is the 180 and 85% rule. If you're 100% certain, you're probably wrong. If you're 85% certain and have a healthy degree of doubt, you're usually right. And these are things that people on Wall Street don't know these days. The average fund, I bought my first stock when I was 17, I'm now 71. The average fund manager today on Wall Street has 9 years of experience. They've never seen a bear market. A quantitative analyst once calculated that the odds of buying any stock that increases in price are 3 to 1 in a bull market. So in other words, we've been in a bull market since about 2009. If you buy any stock, if you threw a dart at the Wall Street Journal and said, I'm going to buy the one that the dart hits, the odds are 3 to 1, 3 out of 4, 75% that you will make money. But in a bear market, the odds are against the investor by 20 to 1. That means you've got a 5% chance of outperforming. Look at the difference, 3 or 4 to 1, 75%, 1 in 20, 5%. Now this applies, there are within the market, there are now, they keep changing this, 11 sectors. There's the technology sector, the capital goods sector, and there are numerous groups. So this can apply to the energy sector was in a dreadful bear market up until the market bottomed in March, while everything else went up. Well, technology was in a roaring bull market. So if you bought any energy stock, the odds were 20 to 1 against you. There it is, 20 to 1. If you bought a technology stock, 3 or 4 to 1 in your favor. This is something that it is not published. It was done privately for a friend of mine, the late Ian Notley. And so most people don't even know this. And as I say here, stocks of a feather flock together. If one has a choice of a bullish stock and a bullish group, pick the bullish group. Technology is a great example. And here's something, number 3, and this has got nothing to do with astrology. Benjamin King's 1964 U of Chicago PhD dissertation. About 70% of all a stock's movement is caused by the overall market. In other words, it's got nothing to do with what's going on in the company. About 20% is caused by the industry group, and only about 10% derives from the company itself. So when you're looking at a first trade chart, keep in mind that you're looking at about 30% or less of the picture, but that's all you need over the short term. I mentioned, I didn't finish this, John Dro's concept of time orb. The way I can best explain this is if you've got a young man has progressed Sun getting ready to trine Jupiter and let's say sextile Uranus, and he's doing exceptionally well at his profession. He just graduated school and he's on his way down the street to meet his uncle for coffee at the cafe, and he can't wait to tell him about his success. So that's a secondary progression, which of course is slow, gradual, and describes a condition. And then he has a solar arc that is very favorable. And a second, there's also ascendant arc, which is where you take the difference in the progressed and the natal ascendant. And this was Jane's group that developed this. and you use that like you use the solar arc. And so let's say he has a favorable solar arc and an even more favorable ascendant arc. He's moving down the street. He looks down and there is a 10, he's in London, a 10-pound note. And he picks it up. He looks around. He looks up and down. Nobody's claiming it. So he puts it in his pocket. It's his lucky day. He gets around the corner from the cafe. The second solar arc, the ascendant arc hits. It's even more favorable. And there's a 100-pound note. He picks that up and puts it in his pocket. He gets into the cafe, and what is the first thing he'll say to Uncle? What is dominating his mind at that time? How well he's doing in his career? Hey, Uncle, you won't believe this is my lucky day. I just found 100 pounds. That was the solar arc that just occurred, the ascendant arc, and 10 pounds. And that's of secondary consideration. It was the weaker. Whatever is powerful at that moment dominates your attention. That's the principle I'm working on. And so we just had Rite Aid. RAD is a symbol. It's a very low price stock. It's a retail drug chain here in America. And the Venus station that is that today, or was that yesterday, is exactly trying the sun within a degree. The stock popped 20%. I missed it completely. But is the Venus station very important? Yes, for a short period of time, just as it occurs. I mean, if the Venus station was on your sun or your Venus or your midheaven, you would know about it, but its effect is not that long lasting. So time orb means you're looking at a very, very specific moment. For example, if a client said, I have very important business in Paris at 9 a.m. on Monday morning, would you look at my chart? You would set up a chart for 9 a.m. Monday morning and do a synastry between that chart and the client's chart. And you would probably focus on the time the meeting opened up. That's Jandro's concept of time warp. You're looking at the fact that his progressed sun may be 135 degrees to Saturn and 90 degrees to Pluto is not important for that one meeting. So that is what I'm capitalizing on here. Jandro made a great deal out of this. And by the way, Jandro would mention things once. He'd write one article, sometimes in very obscure journals. And if you got it, you got it. If you didn't, you didn't. Jane would take those principles and he would expand upon them greatly. He was the scholar's scholar, if you know anything about Charles. So now, remember I said new developments, that I'm always trying to improve this? I already mentioned this, the 75, 105, and 165. Then there's the use of the inner planets. One day, the market's closing. I said, ouch. I said, Seagate is up. Oh, it was up 5 or 6%. It was up $3. I said, they reported earnings. I ran a scan. I didn't come up with anything. Transiting Venus was right on the midheaven on the day they reported their earnings. Jandro's concept of time warp. I was not using the inner planets because when I ran my scans, I was not going to look at the inner planet. I didn't look at Venus, Mars. I do look at, but I first run. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. The outer planet transits versus a first trade chart, plus and minus 2 weeks around the earnings date, because as we saw in the month of May, we had Jupiter and Saturn stations. Well, if they just station, they don't move that far, do they? And if it's 1 minute, the station is 1 minute from the midheaven, it never hit the midheaven exactly. It doesn't show up in a transit scan, does it? Unless you click on station and then you see, oh, look at that, Jupiter went stationary within 1 minute of the midheaven. So that's why I leave a couple of weeks, 2 to 4 weeks on either side of the date. If you're running the inner planets, you get way too much information. So I run the outer planets first. If there's a contact, I then look at those charts that survived the early screens, and I then turn on the inner planets. And by the way, Mars is a malefic for this work. So if Mars is on the midheaven or in hard aspect of the midheaven, it usually drops the stock maybe 1 or 2%, which is not much. Now, I mentioned the use of the tertiary progressed chart. I really haven't used that in months, but I have used it at times with some success when I found nothing by the other methods. And as you know, in astrology, there's so much going on. You can busy yourself with lots of different predictive techniques. Employment of the 90-degree dial. Now, I was trained in the Hamburg School with the 90-degree dial very early on, way back in 1974 or 5 when I first went into New York. And then transiting midpoints. We all know midpoints are important. So Jupiter, Uranus, I know is very bullish. If that is sitting right on a planet on the midheaven, let's say, in the day they report earnings, or plus or minus a few minutes, it'll be very effective. Whole Foods Market, I'm sure you probably know the company. That stock, when it traded, it's been taken over. It no longer trades. But they reported earnings and the stock fell out of bed. And I didn't see that coming. The Uranus-Pluto midpoint was right on the sun, and the definition of Uranus-Pluto can be drastic change in financial position. So the Uranus-Pluto midpoint is very important. So actually, there was the reason I'm hesitating, under transiting midpoints, I've been studying harmonic astrology, or what David Cochran calls vibrational astrology. And I'm at the end of a 2-year course. It ends in September. And one of his techniques is very interesting. It's called mixed midpoints, which is not something to eat, but it's something to analyze. If you have a horoscope of, let's say, a girl and a guy, you can, in his software, run mixed midpoints, which is planetary pictures that have formed midpoint structures between the two charts. In other words, his Venus is here, her Mars is there, like that, and it equals, let's say, his midheaven or her midheaven. And they're in different colors. They're red and blue. This is something new. And stocks that have moved that I did not detect, I've started going to the day they moved, and I set up one horoscope for 9:30 a.m. for that morning when they announce their earnings, and I take the first trade chart, and I hit mixed midpoints. And sometimes you get, for example, Jupiter on that day, and Uranus in the first trade. You don't see that without the mixed midpoint. So that holds some promise. And of course, makes all this more complicated. So let me give you an example of how this worked in August, September 2016. Let me see, we are.
Yeah, I was wondering, Bill, if you wanted to
Yes.
take a break now or in 5 minutes.
How about we take a break right now for about 2 minutes? I'm going to.
Okay. Okay, so are you ready to start again? I am
I'm
currently
ready when
sharing.
you are.
Okay, I'll stop sharing so you can sharing again, if that's okay. 1 second.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I hit share screen again.
Yes, please.
And I hit share, and we're back. So now this is an example. Let's see, we're on page 32. So this is an example in August, September of 2016. These are the transits for that time period. And I'm sure you know how to do this, very easy. Solar eclipse is 90 degrees to Mars, Saturn, 180 to Neptune. Is that a major axis? Oh yeah, if you get hit by that, you'll know about it. Now look, it's a big T-square. And Uranus ties in by 45 and 135. Thus, the degrees 9 to 10 mutable and 25 cardinal are very affected, in this case, afflicted. Eclipse, Neptune, Uranus, Mars, Saturn. So now here's PayPal. I'm sure you all know PayPal. Started trading at July 20th, 2015 at 9:30 a.m. And where's the midheaven? 8 Gemini. Well, what did I say was afflicted? 9 to 10 mutable and 25 cardinal. PayPal reports earnings. And when was this? It August. Well, I didn't say whether it's August or September. Well, we'll see it. And here's the result. That was actually July. There's the gap. They closed up trading right here on the day before at 40, announced their earnings after the close of the market, and opened up trading the next day at around 37, which is about 10 to 11% low. Well, it's 8% lower. So again, it's the afflicted degrees are 9 to 10 mutable and 25 cardinal. So what would you do if you were scanning a group of first trade charts of stocks that were reporting at that time? You would look for connections to, in this case, 8 to 10 mutable and 25 cardinal. There's PayPal. And here is UBS, which is Union Bank Switzerland. And this was for actually July 2010. And look at the midheaven. How can you there's the first trade chart for UBS. They started trading May 16th, 2000, 9:30 a.m. New York City. That's the inner wheel. Here's the midheaven. Here are the transits. How can you miss this? If somebody says to you, I'm going for a job interview on July 27th, this is my natal chart, and you see Jupiter and Uranus sitting on the midheaven, that you shouldn't miss. That's very positive. And there you go. They closed trading at 15, opened up the next day at 16.5. That's a gain of 10%. And again, it was Jupiter, Uranus on the midheaven. And when I was in Abu Dhabi, when I went there, and I went there in 90, 91, the boss called me in and said, Beta, we need your help. The people doing technology are leaving us. There are 2 of them. Would you take it, in addition to your regular duties? And I said, sure. And I bought, we had way too many stocks, 55 stocks, and I sold off a bunch of them, and I had a huge chunk of money that I had to put somewhere. So I put it in this new stock, Microsoft. We had Abu Dhabi Investment Authority did not own Microsoft until I put it in. And they have 11 Aquarius on the midheaven. And one year, Jupiter and Uranus were up on the MC. And the next year, Saturn from Taurus was square it from 11 Taurus to 11 Aquarius. Year 1, Jupiter and Uranus on the midheaven, we overweighted the stock. In other words, we held more than its average weighting in the S&P 500. Saturn squared it in the next year. We earned low. I cut the weighting. So if I get 2 years worth of accurate forecasts out of Microsoft, which most analysts on Wall Street can't do, 2 years I had it right. Jupiter and Uranus on the midheaven in the first year, Saturn square the midheaven. So anytime they reported earnings, they had Jupiter and Uranus in year number 1, Saturn square the midheaven in year number 2. So this one is a little more obscure. This is Lowe's, which started trading December 19, 1979 at 10 a.m. The Saturn station solar eclipse midpoint was on the MC of the converse progressed horoscope. And I threw this in here. This is one of the ones that I missed. I missed it, so I wanted to find out what it was that I had missed. And there you see it fell by 5.7%. But let's remember, remember I said any company with planets around 8 to 10 mutable, or was it 9 to 10, 8 to 10? Notice in the natal chart, here you have Mercury, square Mars and Jupiter, all in the line of fire of all those big planets. And on top of that, the Saturn station / solar eclipse midpoint was on the MC 23 Libra of the converse progressed horoscope. Conversed secondary progressed is C2P. And there you see the midheaven and the midpoint between the Saturn station and the solar eclipse was 23 Libra 40, and there you see 23 Libra 40. Here's a case where the horoscope of the converse progress chart really dominated. Now, I mentioned Microsoft. There you see that midheaven at 11 Aquarius 58. It is very curious to note that all the big technology stocks have this midheaven. That's Oracle, Intuit, and Microsoft all have 11, 12 Aquarius on the midheaven, and all of them started trading with the sun at 22 or 23 Pisces. That's more than a coincidence, I think. So here's an example of John Dro's time orb. Venus was 180 to the midheaven. In other words, Venus was down here at around 12 degrees Leo when they reported their earnings, and there's the jump up in the stock from low 50s to the mid 50s. So that was about a 10% move. So in other words, Venus using time warp dominated on that morning when the stock started trading. Now Allergan, I think I remember this one. Yeah, Allergan, which no longer trades, they were taken over. On April 5th, they fell more than 15%. Saturn was opposing the midheaven. Saturn stationed on March 25th within 2 degrees of the 180-degree aspect. It exactly opposed the midheaven on May 6th. So May 6th would have been around here. On April 10th, solar arc Saturn exactly opposed the natal sun. You talk about an afflicted chart. That's now the 10th is right around here. On April 6th, the directed MC was 45 degrees to the natal Mars. That was about over here. This is a very, very bearish example. The solar arcs added to the weight of the Saturn opposition. The last hit, midheaven to Mars, was likely the trigger that released all the energy. That was a drop of over 30%. Now, here we go into new research. This is a screen from AstroApp, which I am doing with Gene Vicotan. This is an online subscription service which has a financial, and now we're building up the mundane section. And it's by subscription fee. What you're looking at is, I notice that Jupiter returns, as you might guess, are bullish. And that comes about from years of looking at these charts. What you're looking at is the price action of Jupiter conjunct Jupiter. See Jupiter 0, Jupiter down here at the bottom. 30 days before and 30 days after a Jupiter return. This is calculated from the NASDAQ 100. So that's 100 stocks are in the NASDAQ 100. And the price data begins for most of the stocks, not all, in 1980. So this was just done recently. So this would be 20 and 20 is about 40 years worth of data. In 40 years for one company, how many Jupiter returns would you have? About 3. 12 into 40 would be about 3. That would be 36. So in other words, this is about, I think I might have it on the next page. The graph represents Jupiter returns in the natal charts of about 100 stocks over the last 35 years. It's about 290 returns. So that is the average of 290 Jupiter returns and the effect on the share price. And the date of the aspect is down here between -1 and +1, that 0, which you can barely see. Before the Jupiter return, flat stocks rising after that. And here are the exact numbers. Note that there is a 6% return over 41 days, starting 11 days before the return. That's a 38% annualized return. In other words, there are how many days? Well, trading days in a year, 252 trading days in a year. So 41 days is about a sixth of that. So 6 times 6% is about 38% annualized, which is better than you get in your bank account these days. Now, the curious thing was in 60% of the cases, the stocks were higher after 41 days. So in other words, 6 out of 10 of the stocks rallied on the Jupiter return. It wasn't 8 out of 10 and 9 out of 10. It was 6 out of 10. And this struck me. I was very excited when I saw this, but I said, hey, it's not evenly distributed amongst all the stocks. What's going on here? Well, I looked at a few of them and found out if you have a very afflicted Jupiter, if Jupiter is not, there's a big difference between, let's say Jupiter trine Uranus in the midheaven in stock A's chart, and Jupiter, let's say 45 to Mars and 45 to Saturn in another chart. So the ones that made the biggest gains were the ones that had the best placed natal Jupiters. The afflicted ones lagged. That's the reason only 60% of the companies actually did this. But the proof is, or the key is, the Jupiter returns are bullish. And I can tell you I bought 2 stocks. One was Mattel, I mentioned that, and IBM, I think that was last spring. It was about a year ago. It was a year ago, April. IBM just happened to be having their Jupiter return in the same week that they reported earnings, and boy, did that stock take off. So Jupiter returns are another method on top of the earnings surprise method. And this is the type of work that Gene and I are doing now. So your objective, now that we've gone through all of this, is you review the list of upcoming earnings per share announcements. 2, you scan the natal charts of the companies that are reporting. Now you can scan all the natal charts, and you may come up with Jupiter on the midheaven for a company that's not reporting for another 2 months, in which time Jupiter will not be on the midheaven. The fact that they're reporting earnings gets everyone juiced up and energetic, and they can't wait to see what those earnings are going to be. So number 3, you collect those that have positive connections from the transits to the personal points. Do the same for those that show afflictions and forget the rest of them. If there's no connections from the transits to the share price, to the first trade chart, is probably not going to move when the earnings are announced. Take these 2 groups and scan the progressed horoscopes. Do the same for the converse progressed horoscopes. In other words, you start with the natal charts. You know what planets are going to be strong. You use those transits to screen through the stocks, which will the natal charts of the stocks. If they show something, if they show they're being hit one way or another, then go to the progressed and the converse progressed charts. Once I've done that, I then go, if you have 5 stocks that you like, and you then open up your transit scan and maybe shorten the time period, but throw Venus and Mars in, and you find Venus is right on the sun or right on the midheaven on that day. That's the way it would be the last screen that you would use. It would be the tiebreaker, so to speak. You've got 5 to 10 that you really like, but Venus is right on the midheaven on the day this one company reports earnings. That's the one I would go with. And just remember, bullish contacts can be offset by bearish contacts. Okay, I think I've covered this. I think I've mentioned most of this. And I'm looking at the points in this order: the MC, the sun, the moon, the ascendant, the node, both natal and progressed. So now this is the same type of screen. This is the NASDAQ 100. And I guess this is about 35 years. So it's 100 stocks times 35 years, which I'll invent a term, stock years. It's 3,500 stock years. And so this is 204 Jupiter transits to the midheaven, and it's the average price movement. And this is pretty unmistakable. Down here, you're trending down. Suddenly, Jupiter hits the midheaven, and there you go. So stocks were 3% higher 30 days later. Stocks were higher in 113 of 204 cases. Again, 55%. That's not a high percentage. Thus, stocks rallied a bit better than half the time, but the rallies were strong when they occurred. The reason is because the midheaven could be very afflicted. It could be sitting on a bunch of very nasty midpoints. And we had a company in 1990. I just started working for the Arabs. It took a big hit. It was a major embarrassment. Computer Associates, which changed its name to CA, it no longer trades. There was an eclipse 90 degrees to the midheaven with an orb of about 1 degree. And I didn't think too much of it. Well, it turned out that in the prior week before they announced earnings, the boss said that we're going to report very good earnings next week, and they did not. They reported poor earnings. And when you do that on Wall Street, the stock got clobbered. It went from 16 to 10, and I had bought it at 14. It was a major embarrassment. And I later found out that the midheaven, I put it on a 90-degree dial, it's a very bad, a very afflicted midheaven. The first CEO wound up going to jail. The second one, I think, went to jail, and the third one was under indictment. So when you look at that stock, you say, oh, well, this is run by crooks. And you put the pointer on the midheaven, what do you see? You see an afflicted midheaven. So that's the reason the hit rate here is only 55%. Now, this is Saturn conjunct the Sun. Now, of course, Saturn's got a period of 29 years, so it's not nearly as many hits, because if you have 35 years worth of, so it's sort of one Saturn hit, one Saturn conjunct the Sun per stock, but of course you have retrograde and direct, so it's about 100 and something. This is the average of 100 and something hits. So what would you expect? Well, it trends down, and here's the 0 day, then it trends up. And the reason I was so curious to do this was I got to Abu Dhabi in 90 and 91. I'm watching BBC, and it says that IBM is not doing well. It's a very famous major US company, blah, blah, blah. And Saturn, let me see, their sun is in Aquarius. And Saturn was in Aquarius, and the entire spectrum of what we call the big iron digital equipment, IBM, Prime Computers, Stratus, I mean, 3 of the 4 companies, only IBM still remains. There was no internet yet, and those stocks were just starting, Intel, Cisco. Saturn went into Aquarius. It was a big bear market in IBM. IBM's first trade chart in its incorporation sun, the sun in both charts, first trade and incorporation, are in Aquarius. So Saturn ran over both of them. So the news is bad, and the share price followed it on down. And they started to, on BBC, it says, gee, will the major US company, IBM, go bankrupt? Well, I knew that from looking at the financial statements, it wouldn't go bankrupt. What happened? I said, I think I had inherited a portfolio. The boss says, Bill, you take over the big technology portfolio. And he report back to me. And I said, well, boss, we have 9 million shares of digital equipment, and IBM bought at prices twice as high, in other words, down 50%. I recommend we sell the digital, but we hold the IBM, because Saturn was going over the sun. So we did that. We sold off digital, which was a good move, and we held IBM, which was a good move. Saturn moves over the sun for the last time. Thomas J. Watson, the founder of IBM, dies. Saturn going over the sun, the father dies. Remember, it was also the sun in the horoscope of incorporation. So Saturn going over the sun usually occurs around a low. Now this is Mars conjunct natal Neptune. Now this is a lot of hits, because Mars is going to hit natal Neptune about once every 2 years. So 35 years, that would be about 17. That's about 1,700 hits. Now I don't know why this is. I just noticed it, and that is a fairly sizable move. After 30 days, that's about 4%. So that's one that occurs fairly frequently. Now here's Jupiter conjunct Neptune. Same thing. It's 194 transits. And Jupiter and Neptune sounds bullish to me. Well, it turns out in the 25 days leading up to it, it's actually quite bearish. And notice that it tends to bottom right here, but then it doesn't go very far. Jupiter Neptune has a strong effect on gold and on oil, but not on stock prices. It's not the right one to use. Now, this is a brand new tool. This was just run. This is Sun conjunct Moon. Yes. Okay. Sun conjunct Moon, which is, of course, a new moon. This is all new moons since Oracle started trading. I think that was in '86. So there's the new moon, and you see not much of a movement in the share price from 0 to about 0.5, that's about 0.5%. But you'll notice the new moons tend to occur around lows. Now, remember I said that companies report earnings and get more volatile. When does Oracle report earnings? March, June, September, and December. This is new moons versus Oracle, but only for those months. New moons only in March, June, September, December only. These are the months which Oracle reports earnings. Now, here, the move is about 0.5%. Here, the move is a little over 2%. So in other words, planetary activity has a greater effect when they report earnings. This is just proof of something which I mean, you could see it, but I wanted to quantify it. So I can run phenomena that only occur in certain months. That is brand new. Now, picking stocks in October, let me see how much, when did we start? We started at 5, we have about 45 minutes. Okay. Picking stocks in October, November 2016. Okay, well, that was those were the transits at that time. And IBM, I have made the most money with my old friend here, IBM. For some reason, this stock and I get along really well. Notice how dynamic this is. It is Uranus, 16 Pisces. They started trading February 14, 1924. February 14, 1924, 10 a.m. in New York. They were incorporated on the same day, and they adopted the name and the ticker symbol IBM all on that day. So it's a very important date. Uranus at 16 Pisces, Mars and Jupiter 16 Sagittarius, the moon 14 Gemini. Remember I said I did the test of the moon going around and hitting the chart, conjunctions and oppositions versus parallels and contraparallels. This is what I was doing. I was looking at that very dynamic axis. And remember I said it took off on a Jupiter return? Well, look, if you put this on a 90-degree dial, it's Mars, Jupiter, Uranus, Moon. That's a very dynamic combination. If Saturn gets into mutable degrees, into the central decanate, it will sink this stock. In fact, all the old big stocks which no longer trade, Digital Equipment, Lexmark, they all had the same pattern, central decanate of Sagittarius, a second decanate of mutable signs. So Saturn was due to report near the 20th. Saturn will afflict the natal chart. Well, it's just what. So here was the result, that gap down. That was Saturn being in that T-square. So whenever malefics get into the central decanates of the immutable signs, you should think of being out of or shorting IBM. Here is Monster Beverage, and Saturn is conjunct to progressed MC on the 13th, and Saturn will run right over the sun on the 28th. That was written in, remember, I'm writing this in Dell Horoscope 6 months before it occurs. And there you go. That was Monster Beverage shares jumped from 132 to 150. It was due to report between the 4th and the 9th. Jupiter trying to progress sun on the 9th, and Uranus trying the natal sun on the 7th. That's the type of thing to look for. And there's the jump up in the stock. And subsequently, that was, I read those out of, this first paragraph refers to that jump in the stock. Then in the current month, Saturn is conjunct the progressed midheaven on the 13th. Saturn runs right over the natal sun on the 28th. There you are. That was when, and look, the sun is conjunct Uranus. So if Saturn hits the sun, it's hitting Uranus too. And there was the big decline. And of course, it was long lasting because Saturn was moving over the sun. Now here's Netflix. And Netflix, by the way, Do you want to know what I recommended it when Jupiter went into Gemini? Look at this: the Sun, Mercury, Saturn, the node, this Uranian planet Hades. I really should have switched these off. Mars and the Uranian Kronos, all in Gemini. Here's Pluto and the Uranian planet Sagittarius, and here's an air sign, Uranus, and the asteroid Pallas, trying that very important degree area. A Netflix, July 2016, solar arc Mars 90 to the MC on the 17th. Solar arcs usually don't play a great part, because solar arcs, you have to have an exact hit on the day of the earnings report. It's hard to get those two to coincide. Now, planets in mutable sign. Remember, I recommended Netflix when Jupiter was in Gemini in 2012. And then I said, Jupiter enters Virgo. And I said, when Saturn enters Sagittarius, I was telling people to buy the stock in 2012 and to get out in late 2015 because Saturn went into Sagittarius, Gemini, Sagittarius. By the way, the Abu Dhabi Stock Exchange, because I have friends down there, it's only 35 stocks that trade. The dominant degrees are Gemini and Sagittarius. So when those degrees are afflicted, it moves like Netflix moves. And does anybody want to guess, if you take all of the first trade charts for the American airline industry, I did this way back in the 80s, the dominant sign axis was Gemini Sagittarius, which is exactly what you would expect. Many, many, many years later, TWA is gone, Eastern Airlines is gone, People's Express is gone. And about 5 years ago or 8 years ago, I said, I'll look at that again. It's a very new and very different industry. The dominant sign axis is still Gemini Sagittarius. So you have the peculiar phenomena of the US airline stocks, the Abu Dhabi stocks, and Netflix all moving in about the same rhythm, even though there's no relationship fundamentally between them. It's just astrology. Gemini Sagittarius. So this is Amazon, and Saturn was 150 to the natal sun on the day they reported earnings. And there you get the drop. If Saturn is 150 degrees to the sun and they're not reporting earnings, you're not going to get the same percentage move. Now, these stocks were presented at NCGR in Baltimore in 2017. They were all presented before they reported earnings, March 2017. The dominant transits it's the usual. The dominant transits of the month for March, March 2, retrograde Jupiter, 22 Libra. Venus turns retrograde, 13 Aries. March 19th, Jupiter squares Vesta. March 30th, Jupiter square Pluto. Saturn makes a 75-degree angle to Neptune. So that's what I'm working with. That's what I'm looking for, stocks to get hit. But this was presented at Baltimore at NCGR before they reported their earnings as a test example. This is Bed Bath & Beyond, a company that's barely surviving right now. Natal Mars at 23 Aries 14 and MC at 24 Aries 35 will be transited by the Jupiter-Uranus opposition. On the 28th, Venus will be 45 degrees to the progressed midheaven. I did this in class, and I left them with this. We didn't know how it would work out, and it rose by 18%. Bed Bath & Beyond. Now here is Jabil Circuit, May 5, 1998. When JBL reports in the third week of the month, Venus will be contraparallel to converse progressed midheaven. Remember, I said that parallels and contraparallels are very important. And Venus, if it occurs on the day of the reporting, will have a strong effect. So Venus will be contraparallel to converse progressed midheaven and will be parallel to converse progressed sun on the 23rd. If JBL reports within days of these dates, the stock is likely to appreciate. It rose by 7%. So here, let's move up to the present. July 2020, which is right around the corner. What are the dominant contacts? July 5th, lunar eclipse at 13 Capricorn 37. July 16th, Saturn is 150 degrees to the node. July 27th, Jupiter 60 to Neptune. That will probably have a very strong effect on gold. Jupiter Neptune does. Probably there'll be a short-term peak around that time. I just throw that in there because it really, Jupiter Neptune does not affect the stock market very much. August 13th, Jupiter parallel Pluto. August 15th, Uranus retrograde at 10 Taurus 41. These companies are reporting. Now, those dates I pulled off the internet, and they're big companies, Apple, Google, Netflix, Amazon, IBM. Those dates, excuse me 1 minute. Those dates are most likely not to change. These big companies are not going to vary very much from those dates. So this hasn't happened yet, but let's see. So Google, when they report their earnings, and let's just make sure we've got the earnings date here. Google is July 23. On July 20, Jupiter is 180 degrees to the progressed midheaven. I regard that as a positive. On the 23rd, Jupiter transiting 165 degrees to the natal midheaven. So you've got Jupiter progressed midheaven, Jupiter natal midheaven. That's enough to capture my attention. I am going to take a much closer look at this. By the way, when Pluto was down here, obviously we're all astrologers. We know if you get one hit from Pluto, you're probably going to get three. And this is what I call repeat hits. If Jupiter opposes the midheaven and the stock reports earnings, they're probably going to decline. If they do it once, they'll probably do it 2 or 3 more times because Pluto was going back and forth over 6 Capricorn many years ago. Well, they just finished, or this company just finished. Let me compute this very quickly. 16. Yeah, the progressed midheaven was running around 22 Cancer. So guess what? Transiting Pluto and Saturn were opposite the progressed midheaven. And again, you got 3 or 4 bad earnings reports in a row. So if you're right the first time, you're probably going to be right the next couple times because Saturn and Pluto especially are not going to move that much. That's repeat hits. So here is Netflix. They will have Saturn contraparallel CP, the sun, on the 17th. Let me see when they report. They are due to report, on the 17th. So on that date, Saturn will be contraparallel to the sun. And Saturn will be 90 to the progressed midheaven on August 1st. So in other words, Saturn is not exactly square the progressed midheaven, but it's close enough. And by the way, if we haven't seen one of these yet, but you may have, if you have Uranus, if it's in hard aspect, Uranus will tend to move the stock more than if it were not in hard aspect. The direction can be determined. If Jupiter is benefiting the horoscope, it's going to be a big move up. If Saturn is afflicting the horoscope, it's a big move down. Uranus will take the effects of the other planets and magnify it greatly. So Jupiter may be benefiting one part of the chart. Uranus is, let's say, I'll say it's 90 degrees to the MC. It means the stock is going to move. Jupiter means up. If Saturn's afflicting the chart while Uranus is squaring the midheaven, that's a big move down, a big break. Now let's go on to Amazon, and let me just get the date on Amazon. It is July 23. This is next month. Now Jupiter is 180 degrees to the ascendant, the 29th. Jupiter is 135 to Venus, the 25th. That I would regard as rather mildly positive, but worthy of further exploration. And then the one that I really like, and IBM will report on the 17th. They are very regular. They very rarely are not in the third week of either January, April, July, or October. Jupiter is on the midheaven on the 12th, and Jupiter is parallel. Jupiter parallel Jupiter, its own natal place, on the 19th. Uranus, that should be a 0 rather than an O. Uranus 0, the ascendant, because the ascendant is 10 Taurus, on the 5th, and Venus is parallel the progressed ascendant. This is my number one choice. And I'm very partial. My sun is 5 degrees Taurus. This chart matches up with mine pretty well. So this is the one I'll look at first, but all of them look pretty good. let me see. This is IBM 2. Okay, here I put IBM reports July 15th, 2020. That actually should be the 17th. But anyway, it doesn't matter. Jupiter and Pluto are, see the midheaven, conjunct the midheaven. Uranus is near the ascendant. And I'll just repeat, it's Jupiter on the midheaven, Jupiter parallel Jupiter, Uranus on the ascendant, and Venus parallel a progressed ascendant. That's coming up. Now here I'm going to, let's see, we are 7, we've got 30 more minutes. This is industry group analysis, the basics. It's very simple. Birds of a feather flock together, stocks of a feather move together. If you have a group, let's say the software group, the airline group, the banking group, you put all the first trade charts in one file and you run it through some sorting program like Jigsaw. I can also do this at AstroApp. And once you've done that, you will determine, as I did with the airline group, that let's say Gemini Sagittarius, very important. You then look when Saturn was in Gemini or Sagittarius versus Jupiter, and if you see big moves, then you know you've got something valuable. And is this important? Well, this is standard Wall Street research. Research shows that the strongest stock in the strongest group outperforms the strongest stock in the weakest group by about 5% annually. So energy stocks up until March had not been doing well. If you owned the strongest stock in the energy group, that was not nearly as good as owning the strongest stock in the technology group, which was number 1. So that's just a fact. Now, the banks show significant planets and points in the Taurus-Scorpio axis. Thus, it was no surprise that the Saturn-Neptune opposition in 2007 from Leo to Aquarius sank the entire bank group during the real estate crisis. Some industries, such as the automobile group, do not have shared degree areas. This reflects the fact that this is a mature industry and that one company benefits simply by taking market share from the other. That's changed a little with the introduction of Tesla. But for you, when I first started, it was Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, and maybe one other. Chrysler, of course, is gone, leaving Ford, General Motors, but now we have Tesla and a few other companies. And group averages are price indices constructed from the stocks within the group. So software group, remember I mentioned this before, look at the midheaven, 12 Aquarius, look at the sun, 23 Pisces. Here's the big 3, Microsoft, Oracle, and Intuit. And notice 12 Aquarius, 11 Aquarius, 11 Aquarius on the midheaven, 22, 21, and 22. Isn't that remarkable that they have about the same sun and midheaven degree? So if Saturn sails up, now we're going to have a lot of activity because Jupiter and Saturn are going into Aquarius. So if it hits the midheaven of one, it hits the midheaven of all 3. And very frequently, you'll turn on the news and say, well, there's bad news out of Oracle today, and that's pulled Microsoft and Intuit down. Well, that's because the midheavens are the same. So shared degree area, here's IBM. We already looked at that, so I'll go through it quickly. Now, these companies are gone. Lexmark and Computer Associates, and I could have thrown in Digital Equipment. Look at this. IBM is the inner wheel. This is the central wheel is Lexmark, the maker of printers, and then my old nemesis, Computer Associates. Look at that grouping in Sagittarius. So if a malefic goes through there, the entire group sinks. If a benefit goes through there, the entire group rises. Saturn-Pluto opposition in 2001 and 2007 sent the sector down. That's the technology sector. Here's Saturn opposite Pluto in Sagittarius. You get this long degree. Saturn, this long decline. Saturn in Virgo, big decline. Saturn into Sagittarius. That's this is an old chart, but that's how it works. So you aggregate all the charts. You run it through some program that can give you the they can show the dominant signs, dominant degrees, And this was done, now this is 13 years old already. Remember I mentioned how much the airline group had changed? Here's some of these, AirTran is not around anymore. I think Allegiant is gone. I think LAL is gone. Probably more gone by the time I finish the lecture, the way things are going for that group. And here's the airline sign distribution of planets and angles. Gemini Sagittarius, exactly like it was in 1985 when I first did this. And that's what you would expect from traditional astrology. So again, Jupiter there will send the group up, and Saturn there will send the group down. And that's the fourth harmonic distribution of the degree areas, showing that about 15 Taurus is the strongest, 15 fixed is the strongest degree. Okay, this I've already mentioned this. Here's Saturn, Saturn enters Sagittarius right here, and down goes the airline group. Now this is the internet group, 50 stocks. This index, such turnover in that group, it's probably not the same 50 stocks, but it was Cancer Capricorn was the dominant sign axis. And here are the dominant sun signs. And as you might guess, the dominant sun sign is in Aquarius. And of course, they're internet stocks. And that is the Aquarius degrees, fixed degrees are the strongest. So I think we don't have to go over that. Now here's the solar power group, which was very big. It's gotten cut down a lot. A lot of the early stocks are gone, leaving some of the bigger ones. There's the solar power group signed. This is solar power companies, and it is Gemini Sagittarius is again the dominant axis for this group. So midheavens are most frequently in Aries, Libra, and Taurus, Scorpio. Degrees most likely to be inhabited, 18 and 25 fixed and 11 mutable. And most frequently inhabited signs are Gemini, Sagittarius, usually by the Sun, Moon, Mercury, or Jupiter. 2000 in the summer of 07, I wrote, when Saturn moves up further into Virgo, it will square many of the mutable planets in these horoscopes, and many of these stocks are likely to be lower by the end of 08. The group did fall. First Solar fell from 300 to 100, a 67% drop. CSIQ dropped by 90%. We can see how the knowledge of shared degree area was valuable in anticipating this decline. And this is the sign axis for the NASDAQ 100. And again, it's remarkable it does not change over the years. It is Cancer Capricorn, dominant sign axis. But MC distribution, Taurus and Scorpio still lead. There's Scorpio. This is the midheavens of 100 stocks. So you have 12 or Taurus, 12 or Scorpio. It's exactly as it was when I first wrote Planetary Stock Trading in 1991. It's still the same, despite the changes within the group. And that's a 90-degree sort. This is very helpful. If you're, I was at Payne Weber for 3 years, 85 to 88, and we had 3,500 brokers domestically, 1,500 internationally, 5,000 who could call up at any time. We had an open mic system, so you would hear, Bill and Jim, can you look at IBM? Can you look at this? Can you look at that? And this was very beneficial. For example, if I knew that benefics were going through this degree, which is around 14 fixed. During that week, I would say, well, this group, the NASDAQ group, the NASDAQ's probably going to rise more than the other groups this week. Or if Saturn were there, I would say, well, the NASDAQ is probably going to be a bit weaker. And important to remember, it's kind of unbelievable. There are 50 stocks in the NASDAQ accounting for 75% of all the trading volume. 50 stocks, but there are 5,000 stocks in the NASDAQ. So that's right, 1% of the companies account for 75% of all the volume. So if you got a good handle on those top 50 companies, which are Apple, Microsoft, and so on, Facebook, Google, if you got a good handle on those 50 and the condition of their horoscopes, you could track the performance of the NASDAQ, because those 50 stocks control 75% of the movement in the share price, in the overall index. The most frequent midheaven was either Taurus or Scorpio. In the year 2000, this one I caught. Saturn Uranus was square in fixed signs. That topped this market in 1990, 2000, and ended the NASDAQ. Saturn square Uranus. Uranus is an industry planet. It's related to technology. Saturn square it. Not only was Saturn square Uranus, it was afflicting all of these charts. Oh, and that is the book. That is the book. That is Gene and I. Go check out Astro app, which is where I now do a lot of my work. And oh, these are the power tools at Astro app, and that is in search. And Bill has moved from Dell Horoscope to the Mountain Astrologer, Dell Horoscope having ceased publication. And now I can take some questions. I think we have about
yes,
15 to 20 minutes.
We have a few questions. Thank you.
Oh,
Isabella Podlaska has been keeping track and will be reading them out to you. If you also want to have a look, Bill, yourself, if there's a button for chat at the bottom of the screen, but Isabella is there to facilitate this.
The most basic question was at the beginning, if you are deciding to buy stock of a country, do you see the chart of the country with the rules you mentioned? It's from Maria. Or if you see a good aspect for a country, do you decide to invest in that country or enterprises of that country? That's the question too.
So when you're saying countries, you mean France versus England versus the US versus Japan?
I have no idea, because this is Maria's question.
I know, but
I would imagine so.
Sure
yeah,
it's country and not company.
Yeah.
Well, for countries, I would do what you just saw me do. I would take all of the stocks that comprise, let's say for Japan, the topics, which I think is 100 stocks, and I would do this sort and look at the degree areas. And I have not found the first trade charts, for example, the day in which the DAX in Germany started trading. I've never found those things useful. Oh, and I should mention the horoscope of the New York Stock Exchange. That's one I have a big thing about that one. I first saw that when I got into astrology. I could never make it work well. And I finally met a fellow, a New York Stock Exchange historian named Bruno Di Giorgio. And I said, Bruno, what happened on that day when the market, quote unquote, started trading? And he said, well, that's the day they moved indoor. They moved, they were trading under a tree, suppose a buttonwood tree. They would stand out and the guy would call out, you know, I have so many of this available for that price, and people would yell and they'd bid. They moved into a building, the New York Stock Exchange. I said, the date is the date they moved indoors. And he said, yes, that's correct. And I said, so trading did not begin on that day. He said, no, it did not. And in fact, if you think about it, there were very few companies in the colonial days in America. What companies were there? About 3 or 4 months before, the Secretary of the Treasury, who was then Alexander Hamilton, sold the first government bonds. I have that date in my book. I forget what it is. So the bonds were printed on a heavy paper, and the heavy paper is like the paper your diploma is printed on. It was called stock paper, or stock for short. New York Stock Exchange, they were trading bonds printed on stock paper. They weren't trading stocks. There were no companies yet. And we really don't know when trading began. So don't pay any attention to that horoscope. And I have not found the horoscopes of most countries or markets to be very helpful. I vastly prefer taking, the biggest stocks in the DAX or in the Japan or on the London exchange, and doing what I did. You list all the individual dates, you run it through some program like Jigsaw or Astro app, and you determine what signs are the strongest. So that's how I would do that.
We've got also a question, how do you decide the dominant transit of the month?
Oh, that's Well, first of all, if the outer planets, they'll be dominant. And if they are stationing, the ones that are making stations, those are going to be very strong. And if you see something like we had Saturn conjunct Pluto early in the year, it was that back in January at 23 or 24 Capricorn. If that's on the midheaven and you're reporting earnings, or if that's square the sun, that's very powerful. So it's just mostly outer planet configurations like Saturn conjunct Pluto, or stations of the planets. And with the stations, I would include Venus and Mars.
Okay, we've got also a question. Do you use the lunar return chart for each month?
I'm sorry, I did not hear that. Do I
you
use
the lunar return?
I've never used lunar returns. I was taught it, but I never used it very much.
Okay. And there was a question, how do you incorporate earning methods to emerging market stocks? It's really broad. And
I don't know if it works the same way. I've heard from some people who say they use this in their national stock markets in India and in other countries, but I really don't know how to use that. I would just take the date on which the company reports earnings. I would get their horoscope of first listing on the exchange and compare one to the other, just as I did here.
And we have another question. For trading on index, can I use the same method? If more stock added to index or some stock removed from index, should I use a new natal chart?
Well, by the index, you mean the S&P 500 or the NASDAQ. And the addition of a couple of stocks coming off the exchange or being added on are not really going to change it very much. And so again, like the NASDAQ, I mentioned that Taurus Scorpio is very dominant. Fixed signs and cardinal signs are very dominant. If I see primarily afflictions there, I'm going to sell those stocks. If I see primarily benefic contacts to those degree areas, I'm going to be long those stocks.
Okay. There was also a question about your this Astro app. Does this app a database for natal charts for these stocks? Is it regularly updated? Thanks.
Yeah, every Sunday.
Okay. And somebody asked about trades of currencies, if you do this.
Well, there I run, this is getting into overall market forecasting. And back in the old days, when we had the first program, Ask Joe Analyst, I would run composite cycles like the sun through the sign, Mars through the signs, and see how that affects the prices. And then you add the cycles together to come up with a composite, which is something I was started doing in the late 70s, and it got computerized in the mid 80s. But with currencies, I don't know. One of the great experts in the history of currencies is Dr. Brian Taylor at Global Financial Data. That's Dr. Brian Taylor, Global Financial Data. I don't know if he still has it up, but he had an excellent history of the currencies. And you look at it and you really, I mean, you read the history and you're still not sure, you know, as Charles Jane said, the accurate chart is the one you can make good predictions with. So if you can make good predictions with any of them, go ahead. But if you look at the history of the currencies, it's rather confusing as to, I mean, they go through a number of changes like the US dollar, the pound sterling. So that's kind of tough.
We've got also one question about the Bitcoin. What are your thoughts about it? And is trade chart, we could, so if you could use the same technique for this.
I don't think about it because it's too out you know, I'm currently in my home in the USA in New Jersey. I've been unable to fly back to Vienna. I live in Vienna most of the time, and I go to the university there, and they formed a department of cryptocurrencies. And in this country, my alma mater, NYU, Dr. David Yermak, Yermack, he's got an excellent website. He is NYU's expert. And I sat with both of them and I said, guys, what is a Bitcoin? And they said, well, it's sort of got the quality of a money. And I'm thinking, if these guys are experts and they don't know what it is or where it's going, I'm sure I don't know. And it's not really your money because you have to give up. It's like buying a stock. You give up your cash and you give it to someone else, you get Bitcoins. So he has the cash, you have the Bitcoin, or he has the cash, you have the stock. So it's sort of almost like a stock, and it's really a currency is supposed to be a store of value, which it's not. It fluctuates all over the place. And I've seen, some people have written some articles about Bitcoin. I don't really know when it started trading, and there are a number of different cryptocurrencies. So I don't really know. I don't. It's too complex, and there's, I know the stock market a lot better, so I don't get involved in it.
We've got one last question, maybe.
Yes.
If we still
Sure.
have time. Have you tested on UK stock market?
Yes. Yeah, I put in my planetary stock trading. I don't know if we did that in the 4th edition, but we had the horoscopes of the FTSE 100, the first trade charts. They are up at Astro app. We have all the national charts. So I think Canada, Abu Dhabi, England. I forget how many different countries, but some countries like in Germany, the DAX index, it's only 20 stocks. So if you can master those 20 stocks, you can get a good idea of which way the DAX is going.
Thank you very much. That's it. We covered it all.
Great. So if there are no more questions, then we can close the lecture. Thank you very much, Bill. It's been fascinating and really enlightening. And for the people who have joined us late today, the video is going to be recorded, in fact, and will be available to them for 21 days. If they want the PowerPoint, that comes when you buy the audio separately. So, but the video is available for 21 days. So thank you very much. We can't have everybody applauding, but I'm happy to. And please come back at 1:30 p.m. if you've purchased the next workshop, when we're talking with Bill about applied mundane astrology. Great. Thank you very much. I'll see you at 1:30. Bye.
Okay. See you later.